being all home alone can feel like freedom. No one watching, no one listening. But what happens when the comfort of your home shifts into something unrecognizable, when every creak feels like it's watching you? Tonight, I'm sharing 4 stories that will make you question how safe you really are when you're alone. These aren't tales, they're first-hand experiences, vivid accounts of moments when the ordinary became anything but. Dim the lights, get comfortable, if you dare, but be warned, you may never feel truly alone again. Before we jump in, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you've got a scary story of your own, tell us about it down below. Who knows? It just might appear in the next video. This story was shared by a college student spending winter break at their family's secluded farmhouse. Located in a remote area far from neighbors, it was surrounded by woods and open fields. Snow blanketed the ground for miles, cutting off roads and making the entire area feel eerily deserted. The isolation didn't bother them at first. In fact, they looked forward to having the house all to themselves. On the first evening, as the snow continued to fall, they spent hours watching movies in the living room. It wasn't until they got up to grab a snack that something unusual caught their attention. Through the window, just barely visible in the dim glow of the porch light, were tracks in the fresh snow. The prints were distinct, leading directly from the edge of the woods to the front steps. They stared at them for a moment, confused. No one had visited all day, and with how hard the snow was falling, any earlier tracks would have been covered. They shook it off, assuming it was nothing to worry about, though slight unease settled in their chest. As the night wore on, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. Around midnight, while reading in their bedroom, a faint sound caught their attention. It wasn't loud, more like a gentle tapping. It seemed to come from one of the upstairs windows. Thinking it was tree branches swaying in the wind, they ignored it. But the tapping continued. Eventually, curiosity got the better of them. They walked toward the window at the end of the hallway. As they approached, the sound stopped. Peering outside, all they could see was frost clinging to the glass and snow swirling under the porch light. After standing there for a moment, they convinced themselves it was just the house settling or ice shifting in the bitter cold. Still, they locked their bedroom door before going to sleep. The following morning brought a temporary sense of normalcy. They went about their day, enjoying the quiet of the empty house. But small, unexplainable things began to happen. In the kitchen, they noticed one of the knives was missing from the block. They didn't think much of it at first, assuming they'd moved it and forgotten. Later, while tidying up, they found a dining chair pulled slightly away from the table. Again, they dismissed it as their own absent-mindedness, but a growing discomfort made it harder to focus on anything else. By nightfall, the unease had turned into dread. Every creak of the floorboards made them jump. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even though the curtains were drawn and the doors were locked. That night, they tried to sleep with the lights on, but were jolted awake by a noise that sent chills down their spine. It sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps moving downstairs. Frozen in bed, they strained to listen. The footsteps stopped. But now, there was a faint sound of something brushing against the walls. It was coming from the direction of the attic. Heart pounding, they debated what to do. Finally, they grabbed their phone, turned on the flashlight, and crept out of their room. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavy, as if something unseen was waiting just beyond their line of sight. Slowly they made their way down the stairs, shining the light into the darkness. The living room and kitchen appeared untouched, yet the atmosphere felt wrong. Then they noticed it. The attic door, which had been locked the entire time they'd been home, was slightly ajar. A single, dark gap stared back at them. They froze, unable to move. Every instinct screamed to turn back. As they reached for the pull-down ladder, a sudden creak from above made them stop. The realization hit them like a wave. Someone was up there. No longer caring about what or who, they bolted toward the front door. Just as they reached for the knob, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It happened so fast they barely registered the details. A tall frame, standing completely still, blocking their path. The flashlight caught a glint of something in their hand. In sheer panic, they grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it toward the figure. Without waiting to see if it connected, they flung open the door and ran barefoot into the snow. The cold stung their skin, but adrenaline pushed them forward. They didn't stop until they reached a neighbor's house nearly a mile away. By the time the police arrived, the house was empty. The attic showed signs of recent use, blankets, wrappers, and other belongings, but no one was found. Strangely, there were no fresh footprints leading away from the house, and though they searched every corner, the missing kitchen knife was never recovered. On the day Catherine was killed, the student refuses to return to that farmhouse. They never found out who had been living above them or how long they had been watching. But one thing is certain, the tracks in the snow weren't their imagination. This story was shared by a young woman reflecting on a night she says changed her life forever. It happened a few years ago, back when she was still living with her father. He worked the night shift at a nearby hospital, leaving her alone in their small house most nights. It wasn't something she minded. She'd grown used to the routine and enjoyed the quiet. But this particular night would turn out to be anything but ordinary. The evening started like any other. After dinner, she cleaned up the kitchen, texted a few friends, and settled on the couch to watch a movie. The house was quiet except for the occasional sound of cars passing by. Around 9 p.m., her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number but answered anyway, expecting it to be something unimportant. The voice on the other end was male, calm and casual. He asked if her father was home. The question caught her off guard, but she assumed it was someone who knew him. She replied that her dad wasn't there and asked who was calling. The man chuckled softly and said, "Just a friend. Are you alone?" Her stomach tightened. Something about his tone unsettled her. She quickly ended the call, telling herself it was probably a prank. Maybe someone dialed the wrong number. She shook it off and went back to her movie. But 10 minutes later, her phone buzzed again. The same number. This time, she let it go to voicemail, hoping they'd get the hint. However, the phone rang a third time, and curiosity got the better of her. She answered, her voice sharper now, demanding to know who it was. The man's response was chilling. He described what she was wearing down to the color of her sweatshirt and asked, "Do you always sit like that when you're home alone?" Her heart sank. She glanced around the living room, her eyes scanning every corner. The blinds were shut, the doors locked. but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. She hung up again, her hands shaking. Moments later, a notification popped up, a voicemail. Against her better judgment, she played it. The same voice, whispering this time, said, "You should really answer when I call." Panicked, she grabbed the remote and turned off the TV. The silence that followed was deafening. She locked herself in her bedroom, double-checking the windows and pulling the curtains tight. For a while, everything was still. Her phone stayed silent, and she started to believe it might be over. But just as she began to calm down, a faint sound reached her ears. Something soft, like a shuffle. It was coming from above her. Her mind raced. The attic. Their house had a small, rarely used attic with a pull-down ladder in the hallway. She hadn't been up there in years. As the noise continued, her pulse quickened. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. She grabbed her phone to call her dad, but the screen showed no signal. The Wi-Fi had cut out too. That's when the lights flickered once, twice, and went out completely. The house was plunged into darkness. Gripping her phone tightly, she turned on the flashlight and inched toward her closet. She pushed aside clothes and shoes, squeezing herself into the small space. In her other hand, she clutched a kitchen knife she had grabbed earlier, her only sense of protection. From her hiding spot, she heard the attic ladder creak, followed by the sound of someone descending. Each step felt heavier than the last. The sound moved closer, stopping just outside her bedroom door. She held her breath, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. The doorknob rattled, followed by a soft voice, the same one from the calls. "I know you're in there," it said, almost playfully. The door creaked open, and the flashlight beam lit up the room. The man stepped inside, his footsteps slow, deliberate. She stayed frozen, willing herself not to make a sound. He called out her name, drawing it out like a taunt. Just as his steps approached the closet, a sound pierced the silence. Police sirens in the distance. The man stopped, muttered something under his breath, and bolted. She stayed hidden, too terrified to move, until she was sure he was gone. When the police arrived, they searched the house thoroughly. In the attic, they found her smashed phone, along with evidence that someone had been living up there for weeks. There were wrappers, old clothes, and even a notebook containing details about her daily routine. This story comes from a man who had just bought his first house. It was an exciting milestone for him and his family, a chance to settle down and create a space they could finally call their own. The home was old, a bit run down, but it had character, as the realtor had put it. His wife and kids were still staying with relatives, giving him the chance to move in and get everything set up before they arrived. He thought he'd enjoy the peace and quiet, but that first night turned into something he would never forget. The house was situated on the edge of town, bordered by a stretch of woods that seemed to go on forever. It had been vacant for a while before they bought it, which explained the dust-covered floors and faint, musty smell lingering in the air. He spent the day unpacking boxes, cleaning surfaces, and trying to make the place feel less empty. As he worked, one thing kept catching his attention: the basement door. It was an old wooden door with a large padlock bolted to the outside. The realtor had mentioned it briefly, almost as an afterthought, saying the previous owner insisted on keeping it locked at all times. They hadn't included a key in the sale, so he figured he'd have to deal with it later. By the time evening rolled around, he was exhausted. He ordered takeout, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards, a sound he attributed to the home's settling. It wasn't until he was halfway through his meal that he noticed something strange. A faint noise, almost imperceptible, coming from below. It was subtle at first, just a soft hum, like the wind whistling through a crack. But as he muted the TV and strained to listen, the sound grew clearer. It wasn't wind. It was something else. He stood up, hesitant but curious, and moved toward the basement door. Pressing his ear against the cold wood, he held his breath, listening. For a moment it was silent. Then, just as he started to pull away, he heard it. A faint whisper. His name! He jumped back, heart pounding. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was his imagination. Maybe the stress of moving and the emptiness of the house were getting to him. Shaking it off, he locked the front door, turned off the lights, and went to bed, determined to get some sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. In the dead of night, a new sound pulled him from his uneasy rest. It was a dragging noise, heavy and deliberate, like something being pulled across the floor. He sat up, adrenaline coursing through his veins, and stared at his bedroom door. The noise seemed to be coming from directly below him, in the basement. Every instinct told him to stay in bed, to wait until morning, but curiosity and fear compelled him to investigate. He grabbed his phone, turning on the flashlight, and slowly made his way downstairs. The house was pitch black, the beam of light barely illuminating the path in front of him. As he approached the basement door, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The padlock, which had been securely fastened earlier, was lying on the floor. The door itself was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. He hesitated, considering his options. He could call the police, but what would he tell them? That he heard noises and the basement door was open? Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door wider and shined his light down the stairs. The basement was unfinished, with concrete floors and walls. The smell of damp earth hit him immediately, stronger than he expected. The light revealed a narrow pathway between stacks of old boxes and furniture, leading deeper into the room. As he descended, the dragging noise stopped. The silence was deafening. He called out, his voice shaking, but no response came. He moved further in, the beam of his flashlight scanning every corner. That's when he saw it. In the farthest part of the basement was a crude altar made from old wooden planks. Candles, long burned out, surrounded it, along with strange symbols painted on the walls in what looked like ash or soot. Nearby were signs of someone living there, a sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and bottles of water. His stomach churned as he realized the implications. Someone had been staying here, hidden beneath his home, possibly for weeks or months. But the most unsettling part was the altar itself. It didn't look like a simple decoration. It felt intentional, though he couldn't begin to understand its purpose. He ran back upstairs, locking the basement door behind him. The rest of the night was spent sitting in his car, parked in the driveway, waiting for daylight. When the sun finally rose, he called the police. They searched the basement thoroughly, but found no one. Whoever had been living there had vanished, leaving behind only the remnants of their presence. The symbols on the walls were photographed, but no one could identify what they meant. The altar was dismantled, though its purpose remained a mystery. To this day, he refuses to go back into that basement. His family moved in shortly after, but the door has remained locked ever since. Whatever secrets it held, he has no desire to uncover them again. This story comes from a woman who lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood with her husband. They had only recently moved into the area, hoping for a peaceful place to settle down. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were friendly, the streets were calm, and their house felt like a dream come true. But it didn't take long for her to notice something strange about the man who lived next door. He was a single man, quiet, and kept to himself most of the time. At first, she barely paid attention to him, but one day as she was unloading groceries from her car, she noticed him standing at his window, watching her. She tried to shrug it off, thinking he might have just happened to glance her way. But over the weeks, the pattern became more obvious. Every time her husband left town for work, she felt the neighbor's gaze on her. Whether she was outside watering the plants or simply sitting in the living room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. She'd look up and see him standing at his window, staring. One evening, her husband was out of town on another business trip, leaving her alone in the house. She was used to it by now and had a routine to keep herself busy. Lock all the doors, double-check the windows, and settle in with a good book or a movie. That night, however, things took a strange turn. Around 9 p.m., there was a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the sound made her stomach tighten. Peering through the peephole, she saw her neighbor standing there. He wasn't carrying anything, and his expression was blank. He called out, saying his car had broken down and he needed help. Her gut told her something wasn't right. She hesitated, keeping the door locked, and told him through the door that she couldn't help. He stood there for a moment, silent, before muttering something she couldn't hear and walking away. She watched him through the peephole until he disappeared into the darkness. She tried to calm herself, telling herself she had done the right thing, but the unease lingered. Hours later, just as she was starting to relax, a loud banging noise startled her. It was coming from the windows at the back of the house. She froze, her heart racing, and crept toward the noise. As she approached the window, the banging stopped. But something else caught her attention. The front door was slightly open, even though she was sure she had locked it earlier. Panic set in. She grabbed her phone and opened the security camera app. What she saw made her blood run cold. Earlier in the day, the cameras had captured her neighbor walking up to her door, fiddling with the locks and looking around as if to make sure no one was watching. She hadn't noticed anything unusual at the time, but now it all made sense. She called the police immediately, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. They told her to stay on the line and find a safe place to hide until they arrived. Clutching her phone, she retreated to the bedroom closet, pushing clothes aside to make room. She crouched down, trying to control her breathing as her mind raced. Minutes felt like hours as she waited in the dark. Then she heard it. A creak from the living room. Her heart sank. Someone was inside. She heard footsteps moving slowly through the house, pausing every so often as if listening. She stayed as still as possible, holding her breath. The footsteps grew louder, heading toward her bedroom. The door creaked open, and she could hear him moving around, shuffling through drawers and looking under the bed. The sound of her own heartbeat was deafening. The closet door rattled slightly, and for a moment she thought it was over. But then, in the distance, the sound of police sirens broke the tension. The footsteps retreated quickly, followed by the sound of the front door slamming shut. The police arrived moments later, finding her neighbor trying to sneak back into his house. He was arrested on the spot. When they searched his home, they found something that still haunts her to this day. A notebook filled with disturbing details about her daily routine, including the times her husband left for work and when she was usually home alone. They also discovered a collection of items he had stolen from her over the weeks. Things she hadn't even noticed were missing. But the worst part was the final page of the notebook. It detailed a plan to kidnap her, complete with notes about how he would break into the house. She and her husband moved out of the neighborhood shortly after, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. To this day, she says she can't sit by a window without wondering who might be looking back. The stories you've just heard remind us of a sobering truth. The places we consider our safest, our homes, can sometimes hold the darkest secrets. It's easy to think of fear as something that exists out there, far away from the walls we've built around ourselves. But what happens when the danger isn't outside, but already inside, lurking just beneath the surface? Each of these accounts shows that horror doesn't always come with dramatic warning signs.
Ethan creeps in quietly, disguised in the ordinary.
Footsteps on the floor above. A neighbor who seems too interested. A locked door that shouldn't be open. It's the little things we dismiss that often carry the most weight. So, if something feels wrong, trust that feeling. It's better to seem cautious than to overlook a real threat. Maybe it's a noise that doesn't belong. Maybe it's a sense that you're being watched. Whatever it is, don't ignore it. Before you go, don't forget to take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed tonight's stories. It only takes a second, and who knows, you might even avoid becoming a story yourself. Leave a like if you found yourself holding your breath during any of these tales, and tell us in the comments if you've ever experienced something unsettling while home alone. We'd love to hear your story, and who knows, it might even make its way into our next video. For now, double-check your locks, close your blinds, and remember, sometimes what's truly terrifying isn't what you can't see, but what's been right in front of you all along.